This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is Buddhism. What is it? Its history and its tenets. I have two experts on the matter, Diana Y. Paul and David Comito, and the conversation will begin in a moment. The subject is Buddhism, and I have two guests to speak about it. The first guest on the left is Diana Y. Paul. She is a writer, and she has written books, both fiction and nonfiction. And let me just ask you, Diana, if you could give a couple of minutes, a little background about yourself, who you are, were you raised a Buddhist, how were you drawn to Buddhism, studying about it and writing about it. So if you could.
Okay. Well, I was born in Akron, Ohio. My mother's Sicilian in extraction. My father's Japanese. I went to a Catholic girls' school, so I was interested in religion. And when I went to Northwestern, I majored in the German post-Kantian idealists. One of them was interested in Hinduism. Hegel was very interested in Hinduism. And from Hinduism, I leapt into Buddhism, and I loved it.
Well, you said you were raised a Catholic, and then you studied Hinduism. What about Buddhism has drawn you the most versus Catholicism or Hinduism?
Because Buddhism is universal in its teachings. Anyone can be Buddhist in another religion. For example, I had several friends who were Jesuit priests who also considered themselves Zen Buddhists. And very few religions are that inclusive. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's the closest to being more of a philosophy than a religion, depending upon which of the many forms of Buddhism you choose.
I know a lot of people, when they think about Catholicism, Buddhism, a name like Thomas Merton comes up. Were you ever interested in him and his writing?
No, as a scholar, I actually was more interested in studying the original teachings of the Buddhist schools in those languages, Sanskrit, Chinese, and Japanese.
Okay. Well, let me turn to my next guest, David Comito. David has a website too, as well as Diana, and we'll give them, and I'll link them below the video and give them out at the end of the video as well. But David, if you could give a little background about yourself, where you came from, how you were raised, what drew you to study Buddhism, and are you a Buddhist as well?
Well, I am a Buddhist, but I was raised Jewish, and there was something sort of missing in my experience of being Jewish. There was a strong ethical teaching that I was exposed to in my religious education, but something about direct experience was missing. But actually what led me into Buddhism was I grew up in Los Angeles, and there were beatniks around, and they were all very cool looking, a lot more interesting looking than most of the folks out in the suburbs. And I wanted to know more about what was happening, so I got kind of curious about what they were interested in. Then in college, I took an art history course because I was very interested in the contemporary art scene in Los Angeles. And when the professor showed us images of Sung Dynasty landscape painting, all kinds of bells and things went off in my head, like, this is reality. I need to know more about what was happening. She told me that if I wanted to understand these paintings, I needed to study Zen. So two things came together, hip and cool plus art, and I was off and running. And I haven't stopped since. Graduate education followed, writing books. But mostly I've been interested in meditation, and much so than scholarship, actually. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of been a theme in my life. Arts, meditation, those have come first. Scholarship has come second.
Let me ask you, Diana, you've written 3 books on Buddhism. What has been your focus in those 3 books?
In the 3 books, it was on the psychology of Buddhist perception and how it correlates with theories of meditation, and also the role of women in Buddhism. And I did the reverse of David. I started with the scholarship, but then I was more interested in the meditation and the arts in my own personal life.
Mm-hmm. And David, you've written 4 books. What has been the focus of the 4 books you've written?
Well, I started out being interested in, I guess you call it the theory of emptiness, Shunyata. So I started out being a Nagarjuna scholar, mostly because of the influence of my graduate school professors. They led me in that direction. But one thing led to another, and where I was led to was going to Dharamsala to study with the Tibetan scholars there, because I had a lot of unanswered questions that none of my Western professors or colleagues could deal with at the time, which was the early 1980s. I mean, since then, there's been a real expansion in scholarship on middle way philosophy point of view, but at that time, there wasn't really a whole lot out there. So I went to what I considered the source, which was modern Lama's teaching about middle way philosophy, about emptiness. And where that led to was going beyond simply intellectually trying to understand about emptiness, which of course Tibetans consider very important, the level of how can you find it in your own experience. And that actually loops back to what I saw in the Sung Dynasty art, because that experience of the painters of penetrating to a reality that was devoid of certain kinds of constructs, I think is what is the spirit of the painting. So these things connected with each other. And then I ended up marrying an artist, so I was sunk at that point.
Well, before we get into the actual history of Buddhism, I want to talk about some of the sort of what I would call, I guess, the pop cultural detritus that surrounds Buddhism. I've known in the arts, I've been in the arts many decades, and I've known a lot of people who were themselves or claimed to be Buddhists, and they sort of sneered down at what they would call, I guess, sort of pop cultural Buddhism, sort of a hard Buddhist versus a soft Buddhist, that, some people, you mentioned the beatniks and whatnot, that they would look at people like that as just sort of taking and plucking little things here and there, but not really being Buddhist. Do you think that, and I'll ask this for both of you, and I'll start with David, then go to Diana, do you think that there is sort of a thing that in the West, especially in the 1960s with Hess's Siddhartha, and then the Beatles, and all of this stuff, bringing this Eastern thought into Western culture. Do you think that there has been sort of a dumbing down, if you will, of Buddhism and what it really is? I'll start with you, David.
I don't think dumbing down would be quite the right way to talk about it. But I do think you were right when you talked about sort of a selective picking of what was relevant or interesting to people. I think certainly if you identify Buddhism as sort of coffee house beatnik Buddhism, then you would see a lot of that. But, if you look at the history of Buddhism, whenever Buddhism enters another culture, there are elements that are attractive to the people of that culture, and there are elements that are not. And so you could say, in the Tibetan case, there were elements of early Tibetan Buddhism that were extracted from the whole picture. And in fact, after a couple of centuries, it became important to have teachers from the Indian Buddhist universities to come to lay out the whole pattern, because there had been so much cherry picking that it wasn't clear what that whole pattern might look like. And it's my sense that something similar happened in China. Diana would be the expert on that of all of us. But it is my sense that there is this beginning picking what seems relevant to culture at the time. And then as the decades or centuries go by, a fuller picture emerges, and then a creative process emerges where Buddhism penetrates the culture and new things might emerge. I mean, in the West, I think is the connection of science and Buddhism. In China, the arising of what the Japanese called Zen was the fruit of something very unique and creative and extraordinary. So that's what I think is the process that's been at work. Diana, what would be your thoughts there?
Well, when I started teaching at Stanford, words like karma and dharma were unknown to students. So that just shows you where we've gone in over 30 years. But I would say that anything that brings out an interest in another culture is opening a portal that needs to be opened. Cherry picking, maybe some parts of the arts are more interesting, but whatever it is, establish an interest in a new phenomenon. So I thought the 60s brought on a wonderful interest in other cultures that just got more sophisticated as the decades went on. I mean, when I first met the Dalai Lama, they had to try to find people who would be in the private room with him at University of California, Berkeley. There were not 20 people who would go and see him, and the university was too embarrassed. And so they were sort of asking me from Stanford, would you take the long drive over? We're afraid we're not going to get enough to fill a small classroom.
Extraordinary.
And
That's quite a story.
Thousands and thousands are turned away every time he appears.
Oh, that's quite a story.
Let me ask about two other aspects of Buddhism that are in sort of the pop cultural mindset before we get more historical. And the first one you had mentioned, it was mentioned karma, and the idea of karma being that somehow bad people get what's coming to them and good people get what's coming to them. And I know that as someone just growing up, to me this seems to be probably one of the more silly aspects that Buddhism would offer, because we all know rotten people who succeed in life, whether it's in business or in their personal lives, and we know good people who do nothing but suffer and suffer and suffer. Now, I guess someone might say they're suffering for past sins in a past life, but is that a wrong idea of karma? Is that something that's been cherry-picked, that in the West we have a wrong idea of what karma is? Either one of you, Diana?
Are you asking me
yeah,
first?
Go ahead, Diana.
Okay. What I liked about the theory of karma in its initial phases, when Buddhism was an early religion, we're talking about the beginning of the Common Era, karma was a view that you come into the world, you already have predispositions based upon your former lifetime. And I considered that very sophisticated, because in Western philosophy, you are usually viewed as a clean slate with no influences or no predispositions. So I considered it a very advanced, for its time, psychological interpretation of the human mind.
How about you, David? I'm sorry. I thought you were done.
I would agree with that. And what's interesting to me is that some of the 20th and now 21st century research on the so-called clean slate that we're born with has demonstrated we are definitely not born with a clean slate. I mean, in the simplest sense, if I'm born in a Jewish family, there's nothing clean about my slate. I mean, it's a Jewish slate. There's no question about it. But beyond that, there's now evidence coming out that, in fact, there are characteristics of mind that are going to be inherited, not exactly genetically, but in other physiological ways. Now, I can't describe how that research has been unfolding and the details of the molecular structures that, in fact, are implicated in experience of parents being carried forth for children. But there's some very suggestive research that physiologically we're also carrying the experiences of our parents. And even if that research were not to be demonstrated to be true, if physiologically it's demonstrated we're still a clean slate, there's no question about the fact that socially and culturally there's nothing clean about the slate that we're born with. So I agree with Diana that for its time it was a very sophisticated way of looking at things. And in fact, there's a deeper way of talking about karma, which is the basic law of cause and effect, which is what underlies all of Buddhism, which was really extraordinarily sophisticated for its time. I mean, we don't think of that as being sophisticated. We think everything is dependent on cause and effect, unless, of course, it applies to us. And, of course, maybe those laws don't apply because we're so capable of deluding ourselves. But for everybody else, the law of cause and effect applies. But there are these questions of rotten people who make huge amounts of money and become famous, and I won't even suggest any possible names.
Oh, we know who it is.
Well, I'm actually thinking of a childhood playmate who was fined $1 billion for manipulating securities rather than our current president, because at least it was somebody that I knew. But anyhow, all of this is is a little bit beyond the point. We do know of people who appear to flourish even though they're rotten people. The Buddhists had a way of talking about them. My own view is, they're not actually very happy people. They may be rich, may be famous, but that doesn't mean they're happy. And in fact, the childhood friend who became a billionaire, who I've only seen as an adult on television, looks to me to be a dreadfully unhappy person, but he's wealthy beyond my fantasies. But he looks really unhappy. And I know lots of poor people who are quite happy.
Well, let me.
I'd like to add
Go ahead.
something to what Dan said.
Go ahead.
What David said. I'd like to say, too, that going back to what Dan was saying, the injustices of the world, bad people who don't seem to get their karmic desserts, and good people seem to suffer. This is a problem with any religion to have to deal with. The good God that's evil and war in the world. And the Buddhists, since there is no God, they had to come up with another system. And so their system is the cause and effect of your actions will come to haunt you in some way. Maybe not in this life, or maybe not something that others see. But I would say what David said is that internal, they may look like they have everything externally, but their internal psychology can be quite devastated. And the idea of the Christian golden rule is really antithetical to the Buddhists. The golden rule is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But the Buddhists say you can't do good to others until you understand what makes you who you are. If you're too unhappy, you can't do anything for anyone else.
Well, let me turn to one final point that is in the pop cultural air, so to speak, regarding Buddhism, and then we'll get more historical. And that's the idea that Buddhists believe in the state of being, and that people from the West and Western religions especially are always becoming. And this also seems to me to be something of a cliche too, because I can't really think that a Buddhist would say, well, I'm just going to sit here for 48 hours. There was that famous film by the English guys in the late 40s about the nunnery in India, where there's a shaman who just sits all day and doesn't eat or whatnot. And what was the name of it? A Black Narcissus was the film.
Oh, yeah.
And the idea that Westerners are always trying to become something more. It seems to me that both of those are extreme views. Is that an oversimplification? The idea that Buddhists just want to sit around and chant and and do nothing but seek enlightenment internally? Diana, if you want to go first.
Okay. I think meditation is really a grounding. It's not just sitting and just let the world go by. It's a grounding and a self-care that's necessary, as I said, before you can go out and be in the world. And so meditation is a type of self-knowledge. And so when you sit, you don't have the distractions from other people around you, so that you can turn inwards. And it's very hard these days to find a time or a space to turn inwards and think about what you want, what you desire, what your essence is, who you are. And I think that's part of good mental health.
David?
I recommend meditation as necessary for everyone.
David, your comments?
I agree with her completely. I have nothing to add to that. I think she's hit the mark precisely. But
Thank you, David.
Well, you have. So you're very welcome. But, I'd like to make a comment about something that you said, Dan, about being and becoming. You said something about it seems to you, or perhaps others, that Buddhists just want to be, as in to sit still. And Westerners are always busy moving around, and they're becoming. Actually, I think that the thing is quite reversed. Westerners think they are a thing, and they're out there running around trying to do something about that thing, which they are, usually to aggrandize it or to feed it or to stroke it or something like that. But the Buddhist view is that that's incorrect. It's not that you are a being, but you are a process which is in constant becoming. And in fact, through meditation, you get to see that you are a process which is a constant becoming. And that, in fact, changes much of the, I got to feed myself, I got to aggrandize myself in some way. Because when you start seeing yourself as a process, then you also start seeing yourself as connected with others, with everything around. And then your heart emerges, your relationships emerge. But if you're really fixated on I am a being and there are walls around you, well, then you're isolated, and unsanguine stuff happens as a result of that. We actually see a lot of that if you happen to watch network television, which I don't anymore. But that's kind of like a major theme of what's going on, at least in the news out of Washington these days. We call it ego. Big mistake. Gregory Bateson said the skin encapsulated ego, that idea, great, great mistake of Western culture to believe in this and to foster this leads to things that are pretty problematic.
Well, let's get historical now. And I mentioned earlier the Hess novel Siddhartha, which is sort of his take on the life, I guess, of Siddhartha Gautama, the reputed founder of Buddhism. Is there proof that there really was a Siddhartha, Prince Siddhartha, Siddhartha Gautama, or is he like Jesus, one of these figures that it's up in the air whether he actually existed? And if he did exist or didn't exist, does it really matter in terms of historically, as long as the tenets are there? Let me start with you, Diana. Was Siddhartha real, and is the myths about him true?
I think most historians think that both Siddhartha and Jesus were historical figures, but the religion develops hundreds of years afterwards based upon the charisma that the followers of the figure had. In the case of Siddhartha, we've got archaeological evidence of pilgrims who can designate the site. If you go to India near Varanasi, there is a pilgrim dated to Alexander the Great, about 3rd century BC, that is near the Bodhi trees. Who knows how many saplings of saplings, but supposed to be saplings from the original Bodhi tree. And so the archaeological evidence shows that there was a historical figure named Gautama called Siddhartha, meaning he's accomplished his goal. His historical name was Gautama. And so I don't think there's a question from historians of Asian culture that there was actual founder of the religion. But the religion itself, just like Christianity, goes through so many iterations, many of them can't be traced back to the historical figure.
David, how about you? What about some of the sort of legendary feats attributed to the Gautama or Siddhartha, whichever you want to call them? Are they just embellishments later to, move him up into that higher sphere than mere human, or is there any historical basis for some of the legendary?
Well, I don't know that there's historical basis for the legends, but two things occur to me. One is that myth has its own reality, and the reality of myth is as important as the reality of fact, and maybe in some cases more important than the reality of fact. So, all the mythic overlays on history, do they have a factual basis or not? I don't know how we can ever determine that, to be honest with you. But there's another dimension to this also, which is that the Buddha had a breakthrough. According to all the teachings, Buddha had a breakthrough in terms of his understanding of what it meant to be a person, among other things. And he had a breakthrough in terms of his ability to cognize, among other things. For us to believe that we understand what was going on in his way of understanding and perceiving is very problematic, because all the, myth, but even some of the scriptural and perhaps factual information suggests that he, as in many great meditators, was capable of perceiving things that the rest of us who are more ordinary aren't capable of perceiving. That being the case, it's very hard for us to make judgments about what was going on for him. We have to have an open mind to what it is that we're not capable of comprehending. I mean, metaphorically speaking, we live in a world where we can perceive visually within certain spectra. We don't perceive anything outside of the spectrum that we're capable of visually perceiving. We know scientifically there's stuff out there, but we do not know what it is. In regards to the consciousness or the awareness of a great meditator like the Buddha, we know there's something going on there in his awareness, but folks like us are probably not going to fully understand it. Myth helps us some way understand it. It points to it. But then we have to have a mind that's capable of translating back and forth between myth, logic, and perceptual reality, and that's a feat in itself. So to judge what is the accretion on the original story through religion is, I think, really very difficult. And I'm not sure where it gets us, quite frankly, because to undermine the power of myth, to undermine something immensely important to human beings.
Let's talk about post-Siddhartha then. We know in the West, for example, with Christianity, that Christ supposedly had 12 disciples or apostles, and even though Jesus Christ lends his name to the religion of Christianity, most people look, I think it's St. Paul, who most people consider the founder of the original Catholic Church or Christianity. And so it was the apostles or the disciples that breweted Christianity around the Mediterranean area. Was there a similar process that occurred with Buddhism? Was it followers of Siddhartha that then went into China and South and West and whatnot, breweting the Buddha's ideas and words? Was there a similar thing to the apostles? Let me start with you, Diana.
Well, Buddhism started before the Common Era, okay? So it started about 300 years before Christ was born in what is actually now Nepal, very north India. They say the Buddha was born in India, but it was actually in what is now considered Nepal. And so the religion was just one of several. The country of India had a caste system, and Buddhism was against the caste system. So it was easier for the mercantile class to travel. So they ended up on the Silk Road through what is now Nepal. Afghanistan has wonderful Buddhist art, did have wonderful Buddhist art, and goes all the way north to China and then eventually to Japan. But that took centuries. From 3rd century BC, it doesn't get into the peak of China until the Sui and Tang period of the 800 AD. So we're talking over 1,000 years. And of course, a religion as a human institution, cultural institution, is going to change radically, go many divisions and many schools. And Tibet, as well as Japan, because of their native religions, were quite intermingled and became quite radically different from what we see in China, where the Buddhist monks tried very hard to keep their religion based on the Indian texts.
David, what is your comment about the spread of Buddhism?
There were disciples, of course, and after the Buddha's death, according to the scriptures, or at least according to the stories that surround the scriptures, his disciples got together and they recited what they remembered as being the Buddha's teaching. And if a lot of them could remember that the Buddha said such and such a thing, they said, yep, we agree, said that. And so the sutras, which are the actual scriptures of Buddhism, always begin, thus I have heard, at one time Buddha dwelt at such and such a place, and then there's the recounting of what he had to say. But the thing is, that's only the stuff they could all agree on. I've always been interested in the stuff they couldn't all agree on. I spent a lot of time studying a 19th century Bengali saint named of Ramakrishna. Ramakrishna said a lot of things in public that he didn't say in private. And he said some things in private to some disciples that he didn't say to other disciples. And as a result of that, there are all kinds of interesting threads of teachings, some of which seem to contradict each other. And why did they contradict each other? That was because some disciples were more ripe than others, and all of the disciples were more ripe than the common folks. Okay? So they all got different teachings. I suspect that the same thing was going on in the Buddha's time. Ananda may have received some teachings, and he remembered a lot of them, and that became the common basis for much of Buddhism. But I'm quite certain there are other streams that went through other disciples that were quite different than each other. And in fact, if you look at the stories in Zen about the origins of Zen, that's a way of understanding the origins of Zen. I mean, it seems unlikely to me that there's a straight line between Buddha and Zen in China, or Chan in China and Zen in Japan. But it doesn't really matter. There may have been very unique teachings that took that form, were passed through disciples to disciples to disciples through Southeast Asia, and by ship to by ship to China. We don't know about these. But for sure, different disciples carry different kinds of messages. I have no doubt about that. No doubt at all.
Could I add on to what David said?
Go ahead.
Because I'd like to tie that in with mythology and what we were saying about, does it have a real or a mythic? I think we can say the same thing about religion, just in general. This original interpretation, whether it's the Bible, the Constitution, or the Sutras, the point is religion is always evolving. And trying to get back to some kind of original point is more real, and when it's interpretive is somehow more mythological, meaning false. It's just not what religion is about. It changes as challenges and different interpretations occur, whether Christianity or Buddhism or Hinduism or political documents.
I agree with that completely. I mean, in the very beginning, you asked us about some of the books that we had written, and I mentioned that I was a scholar of Nagarjuna, who's considered the greatest of Buddhist philosophers. But when I was working with the textual material, I realized quite quickly that trying to figure out what Nagarjuna had actually said / written was fairly impossible, and that there were always going to be interpretations. So basically I decided, to heck with trying to figure out what did he actually say. I went to Dharamsala and I wanted to talk with the lamas, and I just wanted to know, what do you guys currently believe this stuff means? And so my first book was about what do the lamas believe that Nagarjuna had to say. Because I didn't really believe you could get past that. Yeah. How can you get past human interpretation of something? And in this case, we're talking about texts that are 1,800 or 1,700 years old. How can you believe you can understand literally for sure what that person said, who presumably was recorded? He may not have even been able to write. Who knows?
I mean, another way of looking at this that might be more accessible to people who are not religious scholars, the way David and I are, is that even if you read a novel, you bring your experience and your interpretation to that written word. Even more so to a religious document that has so many subtleties to it. So there are going to be such a huge range of interpretations of that document. So if you think of it as a novel is partly completed by the reader, think of what a Buddhist sutra or a Christian gospel is for the reader who's bringing their own personal life into it.
Yeah, I've often said with artists, I talk about writers and the ultimate failure of words, that, for example, if you took someone out from the Australian outback, an Aborigine, or you took someone from the Amazon jungles who have no idea about Western culture, and you tried to describe Marilyn Monroe, a Western icon, and you used 1,000 words so descriptively to describe her blonde hair and her curvaceous figure and whatnot, they would get a different Marilyn Monroe or woman in their head than what we would. But the moment you see an actual photo of Marilyn Monroe, that's something that even words can't do. So even words, even if they're correctly, even if they were transcribed absolutely correctly, there's still going to be something missing. So I know what you mean when you say about that. I wanted to, before I talk about the Dalai Lama and how that institution got started, I wanted to go back because about 8-10 years ago, I remember there was a documentary on public television here in the United States about the founding of Buddhism, and I found it interesting, and I haven't been able to find it online since. But apparently, it was about the displacement of the original religion within the Himalayas by the Buddhists who came, and these Buddhists apparently were not, your kind of stereotypical peace-loving Buddhists. They basically killed off a lot of the people, these Aboriginal belief systems. And I'm wondering, I haven't been able to find that. Do you know what I'm talking about? And was early Buddhism less what it is today and more like Islam or Christianity, and that there were some rather bloody conquests early on?
I don't know what you're talking about, Dan, in terms of trying to pinpoint the history. Are you talking about the Tibet uprising when the Dalai Lama had to leave?
No, I'm talking about this. These were Aboriginal beliefs, I guess, back a couple of thousand years ago as Buddhism spread out. And apparently, I remember it was a PBS documentary, and they showed how there were bodies found in caves, and it seemed to be that Buddhism in its early state was not as peace loving, at least in the early first few hundred years, as what it evolved to become to. And I found it interesting, but I also found it interesting that I have not been able to find that documentary online when nowadays we can find just about anything. Yeah. So that's why I'm asking.
I don't know that documentary. No. I'd love to know it, though. But yeah. Ahimsa is one of the major principles of Buddhism. So that's why a lot of Buddhists are vegetarian, because they don't want to take any sentient life. So it doesn't follow the principle of Buddhism, even from the very beginning.
Yeah, non-harming is one of the fundamentals from the beginning, right on through the history of Buddhism. And Tibetans, historically, even as Buddhists, were not necessarily vegetarians. Matter of fact, they couldn't be vegetarians because of the nature of their environment. And they sort of accepted that, okay, we got to eat yaks here because there's not a whole lot else around. Either that or we're going to starve. And so there is an accommodation. Again, I don't know this particular story that you're referencing or this particular documentary. Mm-hmm. It is the case that in the early history of Buddhism coming to Tibet, there was some conflict with a local indigenous religion. This is more a matter of politics than anything else. And it'd be a very complicated story to try and unravel in this particular context.
Okay.
But fundamentally and historically, Buddhism has been a religion that stressed non-harming. That doesn't mean there haven't been exceptions to that. There were plenty of exceptions to that because human beings are human beings all over the world. But it doesn't change the fact that the fundamental teaching in Buddhism is about compassion and about non-harming.
Well, let me ask them.
Humans, that's not the way things always work out, though.
Yeah. Well, let's get to the idea of the Dalai Lama and the idea of the reincarnation. So I would assume that the Buddha, Siddhartha, the original Buddha, was considered, I guess, the first Dalai Lama, I guess. Is that considered what the Pope is in Roman Catholicism, as the head of the religion? And explain the office, if you will.
There's no relationship between these concepts.
Okay.
The Dalai Lama it's a very complicated socio-political institution, but it's very important to understand that it's a political institution, and it's rather unique to Tibet. Now, it's not that the Dalai Lama is a unique political figure in that respect in Tibet. There were many incarnated lamas who've had political roles in Tibet that the Dalai Lama happens to be sort of like a head of state, has a lot to do with Tibetan history, has to do with the relationship of Mongols to Tibet, the relationship to Tibet and China, and it would be incredibly difficult to try and disentangle that in just a few minutes here. But suffice it to say that that institution of the Dalai Lama is unique to Tibet, and he is not the head Buddhist in the world. Maybe the most charismatic Buddhist figure on the world stage. That's a different matter entirely. He may be the best known Buddhist in the world. That's a different matter entirely. Okay, and he would agree with that as far as I can tell from everything he's ever said in public. I've talked with him, and we had conversations about that particular issue because there was no reason to have that conversation. But if you listen to what he's had to say in public, he's actually addressed this question. I think I'm pretty reasonably describing what he's had to say, in addition to describing the situation as a scholar might describe it.
Diana?
Yeah.
Well, I agree with what David said. It's a distinct type of Buddhist leader for Tibet. There's only one Dalai Lama, and he's situated in Tibet, although he has this sort of relocated center now in Dharamsala. But he is not a pope by any means, nor is he any kind of a church leader across the bounds of Tibet. He's just very inspiring and charismatic, so a lot of Buddhists around the world appreciate his sermons and teachings. He is not in any definition of a papal figure, doesn't fit that category.
Yeah, and by the way, not all Buddhists in Tibet agree with everything he has to say. So it's not like, okay, here's this doctrine that's coming out of the Vatican, and if you're a Catholic, you have to believe it. He's had a lot of things to say that have been a little bit problematic for some of his followers. But sometimes they come along and say, oh yeah, that makes sense, but that's not always the case. And actually, as far as I can tell, for the most part, that doesn't really bother him. It's sort of like, well, this is my view, and for the most part, take it or leave it. There are a few exceptions to that, but he's kind of I'm not shoving anything down your throat type of guy.
Yeah.
And I certainly got that in my conversation. Yeah.
So
there isn't a real dogma that is infallible, and there are no infallible leaders. The Pope is considered to be an infallible leader of the Catholic Church.
So let me then ask, though, for people outside it, like myself, if we were to sort of do like a corporate graph chart, then are there schisms within Buddhism, just as like we have a Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox, and then we have Catholicism and Protestantism, and then the various Protestant denominations. You mentioned Zen being uniquely Japanese, it was mentioned. So I would assume Tibetan Buddhists don't believe in Zen. I mean, if you can just sort of briefly, if you can give like a sketch out of the structure of the religions. Is there like, the Confucian, is there a blend of Confucianism and Buddhism in some parts of East Asia or whatnot? Diana, if you want to go first.
All right, I think there is a mistaken view that religion doesn't change from country to country. Every time Christianity moves to another country, Latin American Christianity, because of its native values from country to country, is going to be very different from Catholicism and Christianity in North America. I mean, you can think of all kinds of different forms of Christianity across the globe. The same thing is true of Buddhism, maybe more so, because it's an older religion, and it crossed the whole continent of Asia, and parts of those nations, it was very hard for them to interact with each other. Once Buddhism came to Japan and was influenced so much by China, Zen, which had its roots in China, becomes very different from its roots in China. So I think we have to look at religion continually, organically evolving, regardless of the religion. But Buddhism is very intricate in terms of all the national or cultural origins that influence and adapt to Buddhism, and Buddhism adapts to them. So in Tibet, it's Bon, the religion, the native religion. In Japan, it's Shinto, it's influenced on Buddhism. And as you said, China, Confucianism, and also Taoism. that influenced Buddhism.
David,
So the religion is very distinct from one country to the next.
David, do you have any comments to add?
Well, I agree with Diana completely about that, but I will add one other factor, which is Buddhists have been very good at recognizing that some minds of some students are more ripe than other minds that are less ripe, and have addressed that with different types of teachings, which sometimes seem to contradict each other. So for folks that are more what we might in the West call devotionally oriented, there's certain types of Buddhist teachings that really tend to focus on that. For folks that are more philosophical in character, there are kinds of teachings that focus on people who are more intellectual in character. And then you get into gradations of that, because there are people who are more intellectually sophisticated and people who are less intellectually sophisticated, just as there are people who are more emotionally sophisticated and people who are less emotionally sophisticated. Buddhism's been very good at providing tools to help the less sophisticated become more sophisticated in whatever way they needed to become more sophisticated. So that really complicates the picture, because if you're standing on the outside looking at that, you can look at that and say, well, are these different sects and they don't get along with each other? You know, like in some towns in the Midwest, there are different Christians, and they're really suspicious of the Christian church down the street, which is something I've never understood. I mean, from my point of view, you know, they're all followers of Jesus. Why don't they get along? But you see the same phenomenon in Buddhism, unfortunately, because people don't necessarily understand that. And so they will feel like, well, my way is the right way and the other ways are wrong, when in fact, they're all the right way. It's just a question of who's the person that way is being presented to. But, you know, that kind of broad-mindedness is something that human beings all over the planet have to deal with. Not just in the West, in Asia, and not just Buddhists in Asia. I mean, Hindus, I mean, you go down the list, it's the same thing. There's Hindu fundamentalism. We don't know much about it in the West, but there is such a thing. And certainly there's Islamic fundamentalism, which we know about, but then there are very, very liberal forms of Islam, which the media doesn't really say very much about.
Like Sufism. Like Sufism. Let me ask, because here in the West, when we think of the Abrahamic religions and whatnot, you know, we know of, you know, the Ten Commandments, and I was talking with someone a few months ago, and this person was telling me that you know, it's too bad that they focus too much on the commandments and less on the Beatitudes from the Sermon on the Mount. Is there a similar set of, say, not canonical, but agreed upon principles that all Buddhists follow? You know, you mentioned about doing no harm. You know, are there 4 or 7 or 8, you know, general axial principles, if we will, that are common throughout Buddhist thought, wherever it may be? Diana, if you want to go.
Well, Four Noble Truths are the original teachings of the Buddha, and every sect, every school uses that as a core. Just like any law or rule, there are so many interpretations of it. So we were talking about not hurting any living thing. But if you're in Tibet, there are very few things to eat in terms of vegetation, so sometimes you have to choose eating meat or eating a yak. And so the Buddhists know they have to compromise. They try to pick the biggest yak so they don't have to kill 2 sentient beings in order to feed their families. So this idea of compromise or areas of gray instead of binary, I think is very difficult, especially for Western philosophers and religious historians to think of. That there's a lot of pluralism, there's a lot of diversity, there are a lot of interpretations to even the 4 faith truths or core. The idea of fundamentalists, it has to be this way, is very deeply embedded, I think, in Western philosophy. The idea of the unchanging, going back to Platonic values. There's a Buddhist belief everything is in flux and constantly changing, and that would include even some rules or some tenets of a particular school. The philosophical it's no longer useful or emotionally compelling, they're willing to adjust and compromise.
How about the afterlife and reincarnation? Is it commonly held by most Buddhists that there are life after life after life? Or do Buddhists accept, for example, modern cosmology, which claims that the universe began 14 billion or so years ago? Because I think some people who I've known who are Buddhists have told me that some of them believe, sort of, I think it's the Hindus that believe that the universe is eternal, has always been there for forever. Does modern cosmology, modern science jibe well with Buddhist beliefs? Dave, let me start with you first.
Well, it doesn't jive with all traditional beliefs. I mean, for example, there was a statement in one of the, not one of the scriptures, but in one of the treatises of interpretation that the earth is flat. And so for years, Buddhists believed that the earth was flat. In fact, even up into the 20th century, there are many lamas, or not lamas, so monks, who believed the earth was flat. And the Dalai Lama said, come on, we need to get over this one. The earth is obviously round, and that created a lot of disruption. That's a good example of his view, which is, if modern science tells us that something in the scriptures was incorrect or dependent upon the culture of the times, then maybe we need to get past it and move into the modern world and accept a different view of things. But that doesn't apply to everything, because not everything is testable. I mean, there are limits to science, too. There are many things that the scientists really are not going to be able to grapple with, and reincarnation is likely to be one of those things. I mean, it was a traditional belief in India at the Buddha's time, and so it's incorporated in Buddhism. And most Buddhists will say that if you don't believe in reincarnation, there are some problems with your understanding, but not all Buddhists would say that either. And then there's even the deeper question, which is, if the fundamental teaching in Buddhism is about the nature of the self and what is a person, then we really have to interpret what reincarnation means. And the simplistic view of I as an individual or a soul die and get born in another body has to be thrown out as being a limited way of understanding things. Because a more sophisticated way of understanding things is that what makes me a me is something that I'm fairly confused about, and if I became unconfused about it, then that unconfused me would have very different views about what gets reborn or doesn't get reborn. So it's very problematic from this particular teaching, because we're looking at it from a point of view which is very limited, and the Buddha was not looking at it from a point of view that was limited in the same way. So we don't even know for sure what he must have meant. Now, he may have said something like a simplistic teaching about reincarnation for someone that had a fairly simplistic mind, but he may have had entirely different teachings for much more sophisticated disciples of his. And those may or may not have been transmitted. They probably weren't transmitted, but they may have been transmitted outside of the scriptures. So then we're back to that problem again, which is the one that always interests me. What traveled outside of the scriptures?
Diana, what is your thought about Buddhism's compatibility or not with the modern world?
I think that religion was never meant to be, especially Buddhism, was never meant to be telling you about the world outside your own mind, interreactions with other minds. Some forms of Buddhism are idealistic. They believe that you only know your own mind, not things around you, and you know other minds by how they're reflected in your mind. So you don't even really know, this is going to kind of, what do I want to say, ambiguous or hard to grasp. But when you do meditation, you're trying to find out who you really are, not who other people think you are, and not who you think you are yourself. It's very hard to get that kind of knowledge. So the Buddhists were never really trying to define objects in and of themselves, because they didn't think you could understand objects in and of themselves. They were always looking for be influenced by your perception. That's why I love the Buddhist theory of perception. You never really know something like a piece of chocolate cake, for example. Because for you, that chocolate cake might remind you of your mother and wonderful recipe she made. So it could even shimmer. But for somebody else who's allergic to chocolate cake, even their perception of that chocolate cake is different. So that's what I found to be compelling about Buddhist psychology. They weren't interested in the objects themselves. They were interested in how you related to your work and people in the world.
Right, and if you bring into that your own intentionality, then that adds another dimension. So if you're on a diet, chocolate cake looks really different.
Yes.
I wanted to follow up on something David mentioned just a couple of minutes ago regarding the self and the individual. Maybe this is another cliche that we have in the West about Buddhism, but it would seem to me that the idea that Buddhists believe in a lack of selfness. And I wanted to ask, do Buddhists believe that that there is a David and a Diana, that they're individuals, or do they believe that they are just manifestations of a oneness? Because it would seem to me that if the belief is that we are not individuals, there has to be a concomitant belief that people should tend to be more community-oriented, more outside the self. If we are enclosed individuals, though, then a certain amount of selfishness, and there is good selfishness, is warranted. Do Buddhists actually believe that there's a oneness to things, that Diana and David are just manifestations of a singular thing beyond humanity, or are David and Diana individuals? Let me start with you, Diana.
I think you're confusing with Hinduism. Hinduism believes in this Unitarian or universal soul, and that's what the post-Kantian German philosophers were interested in. So when Hegel talks about it, he's talking about this universal oneness. But Buddhists believe are individual entities, constantly in flux. The Dan that I'm talking to is not going to be the Dan in a few minutes. Constantly changing ourselves, everything about us, our thoughts are changing. And ego is the long notion that we don't change. And there's a selfishness or fear of change. And because of that fear of change, antisocial behavior, what you think other people think you are, is a kind of threat to this notion of who you are. And that's where suffering starts.
David, comments?
Well, I agree with Diana. There is this notion in Buddhism, technically it's called the theory of the two truths. And one truth is that you actually do exist as an individual in a certain way, as a designated you. I mean, Diana's Diana because she's this whole changing complex of elements with a label Diana attached to it. So that's Diana. And that's real in its own way, but it's unreal in another way. In one way, she isn't just that because, as she says, she's this constantly changing flux pattern evolving over time. But in the deepest sense, there's nobody home. There's no one there because she's just part of this larger pattern. There's no boundary between one part of the pattern and another part of the pattern. And so that whole dynamic pattern is actually devoid of solidity completely. That's the fundamental Buddhist teaching. So there's just this huge dynamic, fluxing, energetic pattern, which is the cosmos, which includes everything. Now, as Diana pointed out, it's not the oneness of Hinduism. It's something else. But what Buddhists would say is, we can't say what that something else is, because as soon as we say what it is, we limit it by our language, and it's not what it is, because it's what we said it is, and that can't be what it is. So in the scripture, they say that, or they say thus, and they point at it, and that's the best to do. And the great ones have experienced it. The rest of us try and understand it.
Well, I wanted to go back now to something you said right at the beginning of the show in the first 5 or 10 minutes, David, and that was regarding happiness. Excuse me. And I know one of the things, I don't have any children that I know of, but I know people who have had children, and I sometimes get depressed when they talk about their children and they say, all I want for my child is to be happy. And I think to myself, boy, that's a pretty empty shell to cast your child into. Don't you want your child to be wise, productive, to serve something of a higher value? And when you talked about happiness, I'm wondering if you're talking about the same kind of happiness, David, that we think of here, and that these people who talk about their children wanting to be wanting their children to be happy are talking about. Here we think about, well, I want a job that makes X amount. I want this house. I want to have 2.3 kids. I want to have a car that that is the latest model. I want to have the latest cell phone. Is that the same happiness that you were talking to? And is happiness really that important in the Buddhist mindset? Or is there something such as wisdom or service to others that is higher? Let me start with David, and then I'll go to Diana.
Well, I think you put your finger on something which is correct, which is the ideals are that wisdom and compassionate relationship with others is the highest. These are the highest ideal. But to think that happiness is disconnected from those things, I think would be a mistake. I mean, I think one of the happiest experiences of my life has been sitting in philosophical discourses with the Dalai Lama when he was at Harvard. I mean, he was teaching in a way that was so extraordinary. It was almost like listening to a symphony. And when he would reach one of the points of like a resolution of some extraordinary philosophical teaching, I was blissed out by the sheer intellectual beauty of what I was experiencing. That's wisdom happiness, you know? And, I mean, artists experience happiness in the creative process. It's not like, I think that the Buddhist view is that if you're seeking happiness and happiness is your goal, just reaching for happiness, you're going to have a problem. But if you reach for a good open heart, if you reach for a wise mind, happiness will follow. And that's considered a goal, but you can't get at it directly. It follows from something else. So the parents that say, I want my children to be happy, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But if they were wise parents, they'd say, I want my children to be fulfilled as the person they are, and happiness will follow.
Diana, your comments?
I'll just go along with what David said in that the major core earthquake of Buddhist values is that there's no self. Egolessness is going to bring you fulfillment. And egolessness comes from wisdom and compassion. Wisdom of knowing that you have no ego, that being compassionate, reaching out to others is going to bring you happiness. Forget about yourself and go out into the world and help others. And that open heart is going to be happiness.
Now, I just want to follow up on that because just a few minutes ago we were talking about individuality. So is there a difference in the conception of the self versus the individual in Buddhism?
You're asking me first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Again, I would go back to pre-Christian philosophy, starting with Plato. The self was a soul and unchanging. The real was permanent, unchanging, and the unreal was what is changing and in flux. The essence of things never changed. And that's the idea behind the Christian notion of soul. Soul is the pure essence of the individual, and after death, that soul will go into an afterlife of heaven or hell. The Buddhists say there is no soul, and so as soon as you realize that, you'll realize that those around you are who, since nobody has a soul, everybody is community. And that's the trigger for what is individual and what is other, what is self and what is other. And that's where the problems arise in a community, in defining others as different from self. And the Buddhists say there is no difference between self and other. Get over the notion of self, and compassion and wisdom, and that's the goal. Why you're here, who you are.
David, the self versus the individual, any comments on that?
Well, I agree with what Diana was saying. I would add that in that context, though, we function with a sense of me, which is actually fairly necessary. I mean, I think, if you were in a state of there's no me, it'd be pretty hard to make dinner, drive your car across town to get the groceries or anything like that. So, Diana is not talking about a dissolution of the individual entirely. She's talking about a reconstituted sense of me in relationship to other and understanding where boundaries are and are not, and so on and so forth. Now, I think that would be a fair interpretation of what she's saying. But this question of the individual, the person, and the self, I'm not entirely sure what you'd be meaning by those concepts, Dan, and it'd be important to know that. I mean, in Buddhist logic, and there is a very, very rigorous Buddhist logic, by the way. Buddhism is not a woo-woo kind of, whatever goes religion. Very, very rigorous logic is considered very important to know what are the ideas that we're talking about. And if you're going to agree or disagree, you got to know what the idea is that you're refuting or the idea that you're agreeing with.
Yeah,
So,
well, I can just tell you.
I don't know what you mean by self.
Yeah, well, because we had just talked about the individual and sort of basically the river of cells, something constantly in flux as an individual. And then Diana had mentioned the getting rid of the idea of the self. So I was just wondering if the two words, self and individual, connoted different things.
Okay, to clarify, by self and getting rid of the self, I meant self-absorption.
Okay.
Being so involved with your desires and goals that you don't care or think about others. A narcissistic sense of self maybe would have been a clarification.
Yeah, that's the only thing, because I know people would probably, who were watching, might not have made that distinction. Okay, let's, as we wrap up here, I want to just talk. We've talked about the history. We've talked about some of the major tenets, and so I want to look forward into the future a little bit. But before I do, I just want to ask both of you: is there any belief or major idea in Buddhism that hasn't been bruited as much as, say, karma or some of these other things we've talked about, that is as bedrock important, i.e. that, there may be, a real point that was made by one of the major philosophers that is almost unknown in the West and in pop culture here, that should be known as much as the idea of karma and reincarnation and these kinds of things. Diana?
Well, I'm going to talk about a rather unusual and not easily found theory in Buddhism. And that is, if everything is empty, or as I said, constantly in flux, then there really is no gender or sexual identity. And therefore there's equality between what we call male and what we call female, are really kind of social constructs in terms of the obstacles to religious practice. And some forms of Buddhism under the monks, that women could not become enlightened. And that was one of the primary sources of my scholarship. What I found with Nagarjuna and the theory that everything is changing, it's your notions of sexuality that have to change. Women can become enlightened in a female body because their mind is really not male or female. And enlightenment is all about the development of the meditative mind, and that is not bound by being in a female body or a male body. And I think this whole notion of sexual identity is really important right now in contemporary Western society. And the Buddhists have a very intriguing set of arguments about how there are no limits to the human condition and the human mind in meditation due to any kind of gender difference.
How about you, David? Is there a tenet or a belief or an idea that has been overlooked by a lot of people here in the West regarding Buddhism?
Yeah, well, I would go back to the theory of emptiness or shunyata. Absolutely. I think it's the key issue, and understanding what is a person and getting clear about that opens opens the door to all kinds of other possibilities. And, one of them is about the limitations that are created by gender. There's no question about that. I mean, it also gets to the question of limitations that are created by fictive notions about race. What is the difference between one kind of so-called race and another kind of so-called race? And I'll go a step farther. What's equally important then is what's the difference between a human being and everything else that's alive in the animal kingdom. The whole way in which we in this country as humans relate to the animals around us is extremely bizarre if you really think about it. If when I drive down the highway and I see a truck full of cattle, or I see a train go by with cattle on the way to the slaughterhouse, it's just kind of like, there is something wrong about the way in which we relate to the rest of the world, living and non-living. And that's got to be abundantly obvious given what's going on with the ecological crisis that's around us, that the way we relate to the physical planet, the way we relate to the animal kingdom, the vegetable kingdom, there's something profoundly wrong about the Western isn't such a very good language. The modern way of relating to the rest of the world is extremely problematic. And the theory of emptiness opens the window, if you really begin to understand what it means, it opens the window, it opens a door to step into a whole other world relationship, which is a lot more wholesome than the one that we're living in right now, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, let me turn now directly to the future, both in the short term and the long term. In the short term, let me ask both of you, the current Dalai Lama is quite old. Chances are he's not going to live that much longer. If one or both of you could, give your comments on the process of how the next Dalai Lama comes about, that's in the short term. In the long term, since we've talked, you were just talking about the lesser or non-human existence, David. Do Buddhists, do they jibe with ideas, for example, if we create artificial intelligence, we have robots or androids that become sentient, do they have an essence that's the same as humans? And inevitably, if we do explore the cosmos and don't destroy ourselves, we are likely going to come upon other types of life, maybe not at our level, maybe far beyond our level, but even if we just find moss and lichen that's alien on some other world, what is the Buddhist idea about artificial intelligence that we create or alien intelligence? So let me just start with the short term about the Dalai Lama and then these larger questions. Diana, if you want to go first.
I guess what I would say is that the Buddhists obviously have no scripture to talk about this. The Dalai Lama loved learning about science and mechanical devices, almost like a child. He's so delighted by any new device that's introduced to him. And as David was saying, it's an inclusive relationship with the world. It's not dominance of one species over another, and that would include using these robots, electronic devices in a compassionate way, not in a violent way. So I don't see that there's any kind of disconnect or challenge on the part of the Buddhist value system with regard to artificial intelligence or a more technological world.
David, what are your thoughts in the short term regarding the Dalai Lama and his successor, and as I said, alien or artificial intelligence, and how that fits into the Buddhist view?
In regards to the successor to the current Dalai Lama, that is going to get very complicated because of all the political implications of it. And I would guess that the Tibetans are going to have one candidate and that the Chinese are going to have another candidate, and that things are going to get very messy out there. And I think I would leave it at that because I don't want to get too politicized in this particular conversation. The Dalai Lama has had a lot to say about this particular issue. So if anybody in the audience wants to point more precisely about this, I I would actually send them to the Dalai Lama's website. It's www.dalailama.com, and there's plenty of information there that would answer this particular question. So I would leave that to the authoritative source. In regards to artificial intelligence, I really don't know what to say because I'm not sure artificial intelligence is intelligence, and I know no matter what, even in regards to humans, there's a difference between intelligence and wisdom. So I guess that the issue is there such a thing as artificial wisdom beyond artificial intelligence? That's an interesting question, and I think I would leave it as a question because I certainly don't have an answer.
Okay, well, let me just ask you for both some closing remarks. Now, Diana's website is dianaypaul.com, and people can go there to find out more about her, not only her books on Buddhism, but you also have a novel that was released. So if you have any closing remarks, both on your own future endeavors, Diana, as well as Buddhism.
Okay, I think, David, I think will probably add to this. The creativity that Buddhism fosters and encourages is one of the wonderful aspects of being a Buddhist practitioner. Writing is like meditation to me. Painting, I also do painting, and I do printmaking. And there's a sense of the process without thinking about the you. It's the process of writing. The writing kind of takes over. The painting takes over. The printmaking takes over. And you forget about who you are as you're creating this. The novel and the characters take on their own life. And I really thought, yeah, that doesn't really happen until I started doing it. Because there are a lot of Zen texts. The Zen artists are magnificent. If you ever look at some of the Sung Zen paintings that David was talking about, or some of the calligraphy, it's breathtaking. And I have had classes in it. And as soon as you start planning out what you're going to draw, it turns into something that you just don't want to look at. Just not beautiful. And I would say that artists are drawn to Buddhism because of what it has to contribute to the creative process. And I know from my own novel writing that I include the themes of karma, but the process of writing is due to it's a form of meditation.
Now, David also has a website, comito.com, along with his wife. So, David, if I could just ask you, what is in your future personally, and any final thoughts you have on Buddhism?
I'd like to think of life as art, period. The day in and day out. Not that I succeed in being a very good artist, but I'd like to think that day in and day out is an artistic enactment. Because, there is the notion of practice, cultivating wisdom, cultivating compassion, but I'd say cultivating life as an artistic experience is maybe the best explanation for why we're here, quite frankly. And I wish I could do more of it.
Well, on that note,
to be doing in the future, more of it.
Okay. Well, on that note, I want to thank both David and Diana for spending some time talking about Buddhism. I will link to both of their websites below this video, and people can find out more about it. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.